I'm going to start up here, then the lights are going to go down, and I'm going to go down behind the podium. But just as a quick introduction, most of you are here because you knew either Mr. Rogers or Maddocket Millie or both, and you all have your own stories. And that was the charm of these two people. Everybody had a story, whether they were true or not is another story. After the talk, which will be about a half hour, I have some things here for you to see. Mr. Rogers' books, Mr. Rogers' cup, Mr. Rogers' stick-up, Mr. Rogers' wardrobe, anything you want to play with. And we have refreshments over there. And without further ado, I will be telling you some of my stories about my relationship with these two wonderful people, a most unlikely friendship, but it worked. Making a difference wherever you are. Both Millie and Fred lived by this motto. Millie was told when she was planted at her grandmother's house after her father gave her away and her mother had died, make the best of where you are. And Mr. Rogers always said, you are special. There's no one like you. You make all the difference. His charm was that he could put children and adults at ease. Millie on this side is seen out in her famous little spot just by her bridge now. And neighbors who are anonymous to me, but always stop by with goodies or treats or bribes, depending. And Fred always had a camera with him. I have another story about Fred and the parting shot that he gave to us a little bit later. But there are many pictures, 2 of them in here with Fred and his camera, because he never traveled anywhere without that camera. And those of you who know him might have been subjects to some of his photographs. Now, here are 2 anonymous people, not anonymous people, 2 people who people have photographed, talked about, written about. Mary LaCourse is not here, but she just sent me this photograph of her in the lower left-hand corner, a drawing that was done from a photograph of Millie, pictures of Millie from other people, a book that a wonderful woman named Amy Hollingsworth wrote about Fred and his faith, deep and simple. That was his favorite words to describe his faith. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think most of you know that he was an ordained Presbyterian minister. And his ministry was children, and children through TV. Then, the most surprising thing after Mr. Rogers, or just before he passed away, Esquire of all magazines featured Fred Rogers on the cover with a very, very interesting article. But I love the title there, Can You Say Hero? Esquire magazine. Mr. Rogers, a centerfold. Can you believe it? Now, let's see if I'm still clicking on the right track. Of course, the theme was, Won't You Be My Neighbor? I think someone here could probably just hum or sing that song. I can. And we'll do that afterwards over drinks, okay? But here you have 2 of the more charming individuals, couldn't be more unlikely. Fred with his wonderful smile, his neighborhood trolley, and Millie glancing over at her neighbor with that sort of, now what is he going to do to me or say to me or whatever. But, you know, she just had that look about her in an impish way. She could be tough, but there was a wonderful warmth about her on the inside. And their relationship as neighbors in Maddocket is pretty legendary. And Fred used to say when he got there, hi, Millie, and when he left, she would say, see ya, Fred. She did not like goodbyes, but that comes a little bit later. Now, my late husband, Sasha, and I were very lucky to be his real neighbors, which is why I'm standing here, because Barbara asked me to talk about my Mr. Rogers and my Maddocket Millie. And this is one of his many, many letters that I received. And look at that handwriting. I just think that handwriting is gold. It's just beautiful. And here they are, the most unlikely people together, out in Maddocket. Mr. Rogers on top was written about in Nantucket Magazine after he passed away in 2003. And Millie standing in front of her house at the West End Command. I have to say, before I started this, during the day, I stopped out at Fred's house, the Crooked House, and Millie's house, the West End Command, just to see if they had any messages for me. It was so foggy, I couldn't see either of the houses appropriately to get any more photographs, so I'll leave this one as her. But it has, as most of you know, been turned into a summer house. It looks nothing like what it does here. So we have, again, a wonderful picture of Fred, one by me and one by someone else, again, the Esquire magazine. And Millie with a kitten. She had a charm and a way with animals like no one's business. we have a wonderful story, and I will show you the letter that she wrote me, which tells you about the time that she took care of my animals when I went to Europe in 1965. Therein hangs a tale. Most of these pictures were taken during a TV photo session at Millie's by Fred Rogers back in the 80s. There is Fred's house up above, taken on a sunnier day than today. That was called the Crooked House. Now, if there was anyone who was more of a straight arrow, it was Fred Rogers. But his house was crooked. So you tell me, it was a nice combination. I just kind of twigged on that today. I thought that was sort of an interesting insight. And the house that Millie lived in, as you can see, there's just about everything from the boats, the fishing nets, the anchors, the buoys, and behind all of it, there's some dogs and cats and a few other things, and not to mention a little bit of leftover whatever Millie had, because she wasn't terribly neat. In fact, I'm sure there's someone here who can remember going out and visiting her, possibly helping clean out the house when she was not feeling too well or not able to do it for herself. Mr. Rogers and his wife, Joanne, who he called Sarah. She was Lady Sarah in the make-believe land. And Millie up there with her dog, one of her many dogs. The contrast of neighbors is extraordinary. And as I was putting this together, I just started getting more and more nostalgic about what Matticat used to be like and what we used to experience there and how laid back it was and how these neighbors, Mr. Rogers, star of stage and screen, was just another ordinary neighbor. And Millie, as eccentric as she was just part of the fabric of things out in Matticat. Now it's a little bit different. I used an illustration from the book about Millie, which was done about 10 years ago, and the writer, Weller, used a number of my photographs to get the feeling of what Millie was like and looked like. You see her sleeping in her bedroom there with an animal tucked up in the corner. Millie used to say they're the best things, I should say. Nothing like sleeping with an animal. They don't talk back. And in the middle of the night, you can talk to them. She had a wonderful way with animals. I think she was an animal whisperer, we would say, in our way of saying things. Mr. Rogers, as I mentioned, was a Presbyterian minister. This picture of him standing in front of the sign saying Congregational Church of Esther Island was really kind of a spoof. This was taken on the day of a wedding for his dear friend Leslie Brockett, whose husband was Don Brockett, Chef Brockett on the television show. And he lived right across the way at a place called Holiday Inn. And he was a sketch. There's a picture of Don coming up in the show, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him when that photograph comes up. But this just gives you a little gist about how Mr. Rogers lived his faith out and also married the couple as well. Actually, Joel Ives is standing next to him. Joel did part of the ceremony. And Fred played the Hammond organ. And he was the best man, hence his bouquet. Now, what are these two unlikely people doing together? The man who wrote many, many, many books, and a woman could barely write and had a book written by her, about her, excuse me. This is the book by Frances Ward Weller, and I think the illustrations are quite true to Millie's personality and who she was, and I was happy to be part of it. But the letter up top is what I wanted to talk about. When I mentioned that she loved her animals, I figured out when I was going away to Europe, I had 3 animals, a duck, a rabbit, and a guinea pig, that were going begging for a home. Obviously, they couldn't stay in New York, and they weren't coming to Europe with me. So I thought, maybe I'll ask Millie if she'll take care of them. Well, I went out to Millie's with a little fear and trembling in my belly, and I asked her, sort of haltingly, I said, Millie, I'm just wondering, she had a big hutch over here, and I had a hutch, and it was all sort of going to be worked out. And I was 24 years old. I was a little afraid of this woman. This was way back in 1964, 65 it was. I was going on my honeymoon to Europe, first honeymoon. And I said to Millie, would you be able to watch these animals in the hutch? Duck, rabbit, and a guinea pig. Millie looked at me and she goes, yeah. I said, okay, what kind of deal can I make with this woman? She said, what do they eat? I said, oh, easy, just go get scraps from the store. Well, that doesn't cost very much. So we went on and on and on. Finally, about a half hour later, we negotiated about a $300 or $400 arrangement. Not per month, I didn't think, but I think Millie thought it could be per month. And her excuse was, I'm going to Europe and going to stay in very good hotels and eat good food, so shouldn't my animals be treated the same? She lived by her wits, and she lived to outwit others, is how I put it. So here she is. This is her writing, and this actually is from the real letter that is now in the Life-Saving Museum, because it's the only sample of Millie's handwriting that I have, and it's one of the few that exists, I believe, except for Mary Emery, who has one. And in the beginning it says, all the little ones are fine. I would have written sooner, but I asked them if they wanted to tell you anything, and they said, we're happy and well fed, etc. And if I wanted to know anything more, I could call them. That's Millie. Again, these two wonderful people who they're sort of celebrities, but they were, I call accidental celebrities. Fred obviously was a celebrity because of the TV program. Millie took her celebrity or her fame sort of casually and didn't seek it, but she, I think, secretly enjoyed it. And here's Fred's wonderful little quote: by fame is a four-letter word, and like tape or Zoom or face or something or something or something, it depends upon what you do with it, not the word, which I thought was so true to Fred. He had a great humility about who he was and how famous he was. Millie, on the other hand, I don't think she realized how famous she was going to become, but she did have a rather strong reputation during her lifetime, as we all know. And here's Mr. Rogers' very special creed, I would say. You are my friend, you're special to me, you're the only one like you, my friend, I like you. I have to keep reminding myself about that, because there are days I think we feel like Mr. Rogers' message is so important, and this is one of my themes in this talk. And there's so many things going on in this world that's half in crisis and half in chaos and somewhere in between. We're all in transition. And it's just nice to know how special each of us is. And hopefully we can continue to tell that message to other people to make them feel special, because there are a lot of people in this world that need that boost. I know I do, still. Again, Mr. Rogers with his famous photographer's pose. I should learn from Fred. He had a way with the camera. He was not shy to put his butt out and get down and get on the ground to take a photograph. And Millie loved it. And I think this is one of the happiest pictures of Millie. It makes me happy just to look at it. It changes her surliness into a very happy but pleased and proud woman. And I think she had a lot to be pleased and proud about, although she had her habits that were not so pleasing, some of them.
Did you take
Welcome. I took all of the pictures for the most part, except in the beginning. And so I'm using my photographs. And these were taken during that photo session, which was a day like the day on Matticat, which is really foggy. Millie, you can see, still has her microphone on. And Millie, Fred's in his trench coat. It was a pretty wet, foggy day, and it wasn't easy to do this because we kept dodging the rains and had umbrellas up, and it was hard for the cameras. But I just love these two pictures together. They are just one of my favorite pairings that I've done here. And by the way, I thank you, Barbara, for getting me to put this together, because I have so many bits and pieces of my life with both of them, but a lot of scraps here and papers here and photographs. So this helped me bring it together. So we have a cohesive and a coherent, I hope, talk about two very unique people. More photographs that we took, not on the day of the shooting, but this is Millie, one of the days I was out there with my camera, gone by on my bicycle. I always asked her to take pictures, or if I could take pictures, because she once chased a photographer down the road and told him to get the hell out of here when he started taking pictures of her three-legged kitten. That's a legendary story. I don't think the kitten she's holding there has 3 legs, but it looks like it's not going to be able to breathe in a few minutes. And the other dog, her big Newfie, was really one of her prides and joys, and I call him Marshall because that's the name of the Life-Saving Museum. And I just think he was a love. And if you notice, Millie is not only not wearing pants, which everybody thinks she did, because she never wore pants. She always wore a skirt, and that was her favorite skirt with the tulips and the hearts. I wore hearts on they're on my sleeve, but they're on my ears too, one for each, Fred and Millie. I thought about what I was wearing, and then the earrings sort of tipped me off to it. But I love the kitten because I'm a big cat person. And Millie didn't want her picture taken, obviously, that moment, so she put the cat right up in front of her face and said, okay, gotcha. So poor cat looks like it's got, it's not going to be able to meow again. Anyway, she's getting a kiss from Marshall, which I guess means he still loves her, and they all did. But she worked so hard training these dogs, and she did train the dogs, the German Shepherds that she had also, for the Coast Guard. And she considered herself, first and foremost, aside from a coastie, a dog trainer. And I can empathize with her because I was a professional dog walker in New York. Here's Millie with two of her legendary feats, killing a shark and lifting a 300-pound log. These are from the book. And the other one is Millie in the 1975 ceremony where she received her recognition as a honorary member of the Coast Guard. This is what she was so proud of. And I just happened to be there. I have enough pictures of Millie from watching her in Mattakit, but for some reason I got to this ceremony and I was thrilled that I was able to take pictures and saw how important it was. And in hindsight, I have missed so many other opportunities. Millie used to come to town with the Coast Guard. She always got dressed up to do so. And people who saw her were always so pleased and happy and asked to take her picture. And you can see how happy she is. And she's just smiling and her badge says Jewett. Her name was Mildred Carpenter Jewett.
How tall was she?
Pardon?
How tall was she?
Tall. I'd say 5'4" or 5". She wasn't that tall. She had a formidable appearance. She was big, but I don't think she was as tall as she was a little broad. But again, the lady who did the book took a look at my photographs and imitated the skirt with the flowers and the hearts. So I was happy to be represented there. Even harpooning the shark, she's out there with her skirt on. That was a legendary accomplishment, I gather you'd say that. I wasn't there for that harpooning, but evidently a shark came up Hither Creek and there were kids swimming nearby. And Millie got out in a boat and got a pitchfork and started to poke at it. And it didn't seem to get too far through the tough skin. And she said, well, I have a tough skin, but I don't know how tough his skin is because I never poked myself with a pitchfork. So you go figure. But she did kill the shark eventually, and the kids were safe. And lifting that 300-pound log was quite a feat as well because you could see one coastie there, but there were 3 more. They'd all tried to lift it, and Millie was the one that was able to do it and put them all to shame. So there she is, legendary Millie. And here's our guy, Fred. One of those relaxed, wonderful pictures. I think he was really a very handsome guy. I don't see the nerdiness in Fred Rogers anymore, not a bit. I think in the beginning, maybe, but and maybe I used the wrong word, but I think a lot of people think of him a little bit as he's a little sappy. But he was strong. I think he was handsome. And I think if you look at that picture, the Irish sweater and those dark eyebrows, he's a looker. On top there was a birthday party that Fred did on a big boat called the White Hawk. Ellen, you must know the White Hawk. It was one of the boats that was in the Opera Cup. You do too. And it was for the son of the owner of the White Hawk. And Fred's wearing a birthday hat and making a bit of a fool of himself, but the kids loved it. And just the things that he said were just so important. I've learned that those times can be the prevalent periods. Okay, he's talking about kids. I wrote a song that in the long trip of growing old, there are stops along the way. Well, there are a lot of stops along the way, and we all know what those stops are about growing up. And Fred was the one that told us about him and helped us. Millie had a gruff side, yes. This is a picture that shows both the kind of a, not so mean, but stern. She might have been telling the photographer, get the hell out of here. And she might have been looking at the cameraman, probably me. Of course it was me. I was taking the picture. I can't say anything other than the fact that I experience that side of her more often than the tender side. But she just had the look about her as a strong woman. This one picture was used for the exhibition, which was called Thoroughly Modern Millie, Thoroughly Mattakit Millie, which was at the Life Saving Museum about 3 or 4 years ago. And the book that Frank Conray wrote, Time and Tide, also used this photograph. Now here we have Fred in a later pose, just standing outside after the wedding, when you saw the picture with the Congregational Church, just looking at Millie and kind of laughing. Can you see what he's laughing at? Not that he knows he is. Millie's stockings were always rolled down. If you can take a look at that, what foot is that? David, I'm directionally impaired. Whatever foot that is. My right foot here, but okay, her left. Her stockings were always just rolled right here, and her skirt came here, and her stockings were there. But she paid no never mind, and she just put her arms across and said, okay, here I am, and take me for what I am. That's what I loved about Millie. There was no nonsense about her. And Fred, on the other hand, was just as true as they can be, standing there, getting a little chuckle out of something someone just said. Okay, let's see if I'm going in the right direction. Millie, again, in one of her grumpy moods, but also thinking about something. And she loved to jest. She was just saying, don't hurt me, don't help me, or something. You know, they were just sort of, or I don't know what they told her, but she was playing stick 'em up or something. But I just caught that gesture when she was in the middle of this filming. It was a wonderful day for me. I was just sort of a novice photographer on the set. Fred had said, just come on over and take some pictures. But I realized I struck a gold mine because there was a lot of emotion that day and a wide range of images. Again, I'm using Mr. Rogers in there with his make-believe, and we're glad to be your neighbors, with his little kingdom there. More Millie at the Coast Guard. I considered these pictures pretty precious. I haven't seen too many others, although there's a man named Stan Grossfeld who did a lot of pictures of Millie, and for his days, what newspaper? The Boston Globe, I think. But there's a very happy Millie. It also looks like she didn't have her teeth in that day, but I'm not sure if that was the case. She's looking pretty pleased and proud. I think that was one of her proudest moments when she received her certificate, and they made her officially the West End Command out in Matticat. I don't have a picture of that, but I took one today in the fog. You can barely read it. The famous picture of Millie with her birthday cake, that's the preamble to the real one. But you can see again, it was a breezy day and her skirt is kind of flapping in the breeze. It was a wonderful chocolate cake. I can't say I got a taste of it, but I gather it was legendary because people in the neighborhood said it was good. I don't know who baked it, but I have a feeling I could find out. Again, a picture of Millie's house to give you an idea of what it looked like. It is pretty cleaned up today. I went out there and I could just see the neat, tidy quarterboard and the grass all mowed and not a sign of a dog or a barbed wire or anything else or an anchor. But it was pretty salty, and I kind of miss that. Those are the days you could leave anything out in Matticat, no one would take it. It just sort of stayed there and aged with the weather. David wouldn't let me get away with that anymore, would he, David? Anyway, I think my house looked a little bit more like Millie's back in the 60s when I was taking these pictures than it does now. And it was just a cottage. In fact, it was smaller than Millie's cottage. But those days are gone. Here we go. And this next one is the official Matticat Millie and her birthday cake. But look at the difference between what happened between that and then that. And that has become a rather famous postcard, I'm happy to say. But the story about that postcard goes a little bit like the one about my asking her to take care of the animals. I figured I had to ask her. She's going to see it sooner or later. So how do I do that? She didn't like her picture taken. How do I approach her? Well, I decided one day I would just leave her a note with a couple $100 bills in there and a postcard and say, do you mind if I use this as a postcard? And I waited and I waited. Weeks went by. I didn't hear from her, maybe 2 weeks. One day the phone rang. She picked up the phone and called me. She goes, I guess it's okay. Boom. She didn't ask me for any more money. She was a woman of few words, but she guessed it was okay. Now the other picture shows Millie sort of looking at the cake as if she was going to blow him out. I'm not sure what happened there, but I just put it in there because I thought it was an interesting angle. Again, we have the neighbors stopping by. They may have been the ones that made the cake for her, but I don't know their names. But I think if you look at that lady, her hair and her jacket, you'll see that that's really definitely early 60s. Right? So more Millie with her dog. Sorry, that's a repeat of her dog kissing her, but I love it. And there you have Marshall being hooked up to the wagon. You can notice that Millie's barefooted, and she's got a rope around him. She didn't care much about leashes or protocol. And she's bending down with everything she's got to fix the wagon that he's carrying. But note what Marshall's carrying in his mouth there. You'll see a little bit more of that later. Now we have the official presentation. Well, it wasn't exactly. Fred was asking Millie to talk about her days in the Coast Guard or her award, and used her hat to bring that to mind. And she's just shooting the breeze, talking to him over the fence. And here's my famous friend Don Brockett, who was Chef Brockett on the television program, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He was a character. If you think Millie and Fred were opposites, Fred and Don were about the most opposite of two men or human beings that I could imagine. They used to have a legendary party, the only one of the summer that you could not refuse to go to, because it was always at 7 a.m. on Monday morning. How many other dates could you say you had at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning? And in the middle of the summer, of course, it was nice and bright, and it was usually at the Indian Room, or the Overlook, I guess it was called, or here it was at the Jetties Beach, the children's beach. And Don is in his t-shirt. He was a big, big man, and look at how thin Fred is, with his camera. And he invited all of his Smith Point neighbors to come. And it was definitely a very cherished invitation. I can't say anything more, but it was something that we all look forward to. The one that was at the Overlook is the one I'll never forget, and I put this picture of Fred pouring a champagne here because it reminds me of Don Brockett's going around. We all had our juice on the table with a little cup with something in it. It was probably orange juice or something. And everybody sat down, and Fred went and picked up his orange juice and just about spit it out and said, "Who put hooch in my orange juice?" And of course, Don had gone around with a little bottle of vodka and given everybody a little topping off of vodka in their orange juice who wanted it, and decided to fool Fred because Fred was a complete teetotaler. He drank ginger ale or water, and his habits were very pure. He swam in the morning. He never drank. And he's a vegetarian. And when you find out how he died, if some of you know, you'll find that out later, you'll be wondered and shocked how that man could have died of what he died of. So there's another picture up top, which just reminds me of how really generous Fred was with his time. A friend of mine named Liza Wolf is a first grade teacher, or preschool teacher out in Kalamazoo, Michigan. She almost wet her pants when she saw Mr. Rogers walk in that day in my little shack in Matticat. And there she is sitting next to him. She had just prepared that t-shirt for him that says, "I'm Mrs. Wolf's friend, Fred." She gave it to all of her special people, and he's wearing it. You would have thought it was Cary Grant. She was so excited to see this star of stage and screen. And you can see the difference how Mr. Rogers has aged in the last picture, which is one of the later pictures. And that was the day of the wedding for Leslie Brockett. And now we have an article that Fred wrote, which I reread, and I really got sort of emotional about it because Fred talks about the ritual that he did when he went to the summer house after Millie had died in 1990. And he used to say and shout out the window, "Hi, Millie." And of course it says there was no one answering, but Millie died in 1990. But returning to Nantucket just wouldn't be the same without greeting my friend. And it goes on to say about how they met, and it was very touching that they became so close, and Millie watched out for his house, and he obviously watched out for her, and when she was sick, he went and held her hand and helped her in the hospital and did a lot of wonderful things out of his kindness and love for her. And there she is out there with her dog, very proudly showing him off. Real show dog, right, David? Just like Blanche. Anyway, that article was in the Reader's Digest, and I think what it says is a woman of few words and even fewer social niceties. And here's the man who is Mr. Nice. She taught me something about the human heart, and I believe everything he said in that article, and it's quite wonderful to reread it. Now, Millie's famous departure was something to behold, and I don't know where I was on the day it happened, March 1st, but that's the day she died. But shortly after, mid-March, I guess I may have been in New York, but I never saw the ceremony, but I read about it. And her ashes were scattered over Hither Creek by a Coast Guard helicopter. This is what Millie had wished. However, it was a very windy, blowy day, and it seems that, this is either legendary or true, that the ashes got hooked up in the propeller of the helicopter, and so all got sort of sucked in and were deposited at Otis Air Force Base rather than in Hither Creek. At least that's what the people who said that they were there on the day. And in fact, the woman who wrote the story that I just read about that incident said that her husband was one of the people there, one of the coasties, and so she swears it was true. But I like the way it said that she would have liked the new sign that marks the bridge, and it stands loud and clear out there in Matticat. But you wouldn't know it was a West End command because no barking dogs, no mound of scallop shells, and no ducklings in the bathtub. And she did have ducks in the bathtub. I saw them. And Millie would always say, she didn't like goodbyes, so she would say, "See ya." And we'll see that again. So here we have to say goodbye to our dear friends, our neighbors. That's the iconic picture. You each have a copy of it, Fred and Millie. And there are many, many accolades and tributes, and the ones to Fred were quite touching, and Millie was presented as thoroughly Madicket Millie in an exhibition out at the Life Saving Museum about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was happy to be a part of it. And there was a video of this whole taping session that I did with them. And how's our time going, folks? Getting close? So there we have some of the pictures that I did not take of Millie in that brochure, but you've seen the other ones that I did take. And it's just a very touching moment to remember our two neighbors. Millie, born September 24th, 1903, died March 1st, 1990. March 20th, Fred Rogers, a day, the beginning of spring I always celebrate, died on my father's birthday, February 27th, 2003. And I had a call from our priest at that time, Joel Ives, who was a great friend of Fred's because he watched him as a child and he became enamored of him being a neighbor and a parishioner, which was really special. And he called me at 6 a.m. on February 27th. He said, I just have to tell you that Fred died before you see it in the newspaper. No one knew how sick he was. He was only sick for a matter of weeks. He had stomach cancer. The vegetarian who didn't drink, didn't smoke, and swam every morning. How can you believe that he had stomach cancer? Died at the age of 74. And his message still rings true to every beat of my heart. The greatest gift you ever give is your honest self. We just heard that about you are the only person in the world and you are special. No one can live the life you live. And though no human being is perfect, we have the chance to bring what's unique about us to live in a redeeming way. I call this the gospel according to Mr. Rogers. And I love his gospel of kindness. As the Dalai Lama says, my religion is kindness. And Fred says there are 3 ways to ultimate success. The first way is to be kind. The second way is to be kind. And the third way is to be kind. We all would agree with that, I hope. Now, after he died, there were so many things written about and for him, but I love this cartoon. It's a little crooked, but what would Mr. Rogers do? He always wore a cardigan, so here we have this rather ghoulish-looking character. And he says, is that a cardigan sweater, Vic? Yes, I'm wearing it in honor of Mr. Rogers. It's not even black or gold. You must have been a big fan. That's right, neighbor. My dad was a tough steelworker who never shared his feelings. Mr. Rogers made it okay to have feelings, and I think he did. He taught me to love myself and to accept others for what they are. Even Cleveland Park fans, even Cleveland fans. Okay, there's an inside joke there. I didn't get that. Yes, even them. His message of tolerance and love is especially important now that everyone is focused on terrorism and war. It's just as important in this moment. If I had but one wish for the world, it would be that all of our leaders would stop and ask themselves, and boy, on a day like today, wouldn't that be an important message? I'm not going to talk politics, but you understand the innuendo. What would Mr. Rogers do? Certainly not what we just did. Okay, folks, that's enough politics. Here we have, and I'm still acting out of my child because Fred has brought it out in me. And I love this one. The child is in me still, and sometimes not so still. If there ever was a motto for myself, that is it. The restlessness persists. And here we have a little bit more about how Fred has come into the news again and again and again. And this just came up. This was 2 weeks ago, the story that will bring tear to your eye. I have Kleenex up there if anybody wants it. Mr. Rogers' quotation about looking for the helpers in times of trouble. When I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news. My mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are. That was read and brought to mind after the Manchester bombing, which was just a couple of weeks ago. And I thought that, I get goosebumps thinking about it. And he just had that way of getting into everybody's under their skin, and bringing tears to their eyes. So here we have Mr. Rogers' accolades again. This film by Ben and Chris Wagner was shown here a couple years ago. I'm featured in it as one Madicket neighbor. I look a bit like Madicket Millie in it. I have a rather bedraggled looking thrift shop coat on. I didn't realize he was filming from the moment he walked in. I have clogs on. My hair's hanging like this, and I have a Dutch or a Greek sailor's hat on. And I thought, I look more like Madicket Millie than Madicket Millie looked like. So that, I don't have a picture of me because it's in the film. So if you have a chance to see it, I actually have it here. But you can purchase it, or you can probably get it online, and it's shown on PBS all the time. But this was a an article about this film that was made by the Benjamin and Chris Wagner. And there's the cover of the film. And I remember I said, look at the dog again. He's carrying Millie's hat. To me, that's a little bit of eulogy for Millie. Because the eulogy for Fred's, I remember going out to the house with Joel. We did communion on the deck where we had done the wedding. And it was a cold, cold March day. And flowers had been left at Fred's house. It was very, very touching. Notes had been left, and you could just feel the love, the people who just felt they had to do something when they found out that Fred had died on February 27th. And you know how short February is, so this was an early day in March. And just before his birthday, we went out there and had a little cry and a little toast, and I think I even let off a balloon, which I wouldn't be allowed to do today, but I did then. So here's a little tribute to Fred and to Millie. My life is my message. I think that's been the message all through this talk. And Fred is giving us, just again, the same message: I like you just the way you are. And if anybody who reminded me hasn't heard what Fred said to the Senate way back when he pleaded for children on children's television, public television, it's very touching, and you can get it on YouTube. You can get so much on Fred Rogers on YouTube. Not as much about Millie, but there's something. But maybe this show will be on next. So here's a little plug. Just show you how much I love Fred. I created him as one of my neighbors, or one of my categories. I didn't, but someone did. For the Arts Council Merit Award that's coming up. Just want to see where Fred gets in there. But also it has a little letter in there that Fred wrote in his own beautiful handwriting, and it has the sermon I preached on February 27th, right after Fred died. Actually, the year after Fred died, on his anniversary. And I started out with, love your neighbor as yourself. So there, Mr. Rogers keeps on giving and keeps on talking to us through his inestimable words. And I'm going to close with saying that there are unexpected endings to this story and unexpected beginnings. The ending on this story, the picture up there, is the last time I saw Fred. And he had come to our house to say goodbye before the summer was over, or just about when the summer was over. I think it was Labor Day weekend. He had also, this I forgot to say earlier, stopped by the house on 9/11. It was the most meaningful visit of anyone who just happened to drop by that day, because we were all in shock and numb. Fred and Joanne had been going around the neighborhood just to see their neighbors and to say, we're here for you, we're here. How are you? And it was really one of the more touching things on that awful, awful day. But this picture was taken just before they left, and we were gathered around having lemonade or something, and I said to Fred, after I took this picture, can I take another picture? And he said no, and he got his camera up, and I don't have the picture to show you, but he took a picture of us. And one of his letters says it's like sending Colts to Newcastle to send us pictures, but I really appreciated it. And I said, oh, don't worry, I'll get a picture of you next year. Well, there was no next year. So Fred got the parting shot, and I got this shot. That was my last picture of Fred. And as most people know, we've also created Millie's out at the West End, and wouldn't she be surprised at what we have done with her name and with her reputation. But there are a lot of photographs that you've seen here or out there, and well, it's nice to have it represented. I think it would be a little surprise to Millie, but there it is. And here's something that I just realized was a very meaningful picture. A friend of mine got this Madicket hat at the Madicket, at Millie's, and the button, which was created for a talk I gave earlier. And I realized Madicket Millie is represented there, and the fish. The fish is a symbol for Jesus the Christ, because in Greek, the letters for the fish were used as a sign language and symbol for the early Christians. They drew the sign of a fish to let people know that they were Christian. It wasn't a spoken thing because it wasn't as obvious today, as welcome today as it was back then when there was persecution. So I realized we have both Fred and Millie represented here. Fred by the fish and Millie. And he used to draw the fish and use the Greek letters. And Millie's button. And so I say, as we end this slideshow, hats off to both Millie and Fred. And thank you, Millie and Fred, for being my extraordinary, ordinary neighbors. The picture of Millie is a little bit pale, but her hand is right on her heart. She's been very touched and moved by something, and I just love that photograph. And that one of Fred is just an embrace. It's just a warm, welcome embrace. So, as they said to each other, see ya. Thank you for coming. And I would love to hear anyone tell our stories.